Okay, so have you ever looked up at the night sky and just wondered, really wondered what it all means? Where did it all come from? And is there some kind of grand design behind it all, or is it all just random chance?
Yeah, that's the kind of question that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries, really. And it's a question that goes right to the heart of metaphysics and cosmology.
Yeah.
What is the nature of reality? How did the universe come into being? And is there some kind of order or purpose to it all?
That's what we're going to be diving into today,
Yeah.
right? We're looking at one of the most influential attempts to tackle these really big questions, Plato's Timaeus.
Exactly. The Timaeus is this really remarkable dialogue. It's dense, it's complex, but it's also incredibly insightful. It offers this really detailed account of the creation of the universe, its structure, its beauty, and even touches on the nature of the human soul and our place within this grand cosmic scheme.
So for our listeners out there, who are fascinated by these big philosophical questions, this deep dive is for you. We're going to try to unpack some of the key ideas and arguments of the Timaeus and, you know, maybe come away with a little bit better understanding of Plato's thought and its enduring relevance.
And just to make sure we're on solid ground, our exploration is going to be guided by the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on the Timaeus. It's a really great resource. It synthesizes centuries of scholarship and gives us a really strong foundation for our discussion.
So let's start with the big picture. The Timaeus presents this vision of a universe that's been intentionally crafted by a divine craftsman, this figure that Plato calls the demiurge.
Right. This isn't just some random spontaneous generation. The demiurge is presented as this being of supreme rationality and goodness. He looks to a perfect eternal model and shapes the universe according to this blueprint.
So it's like he's working with pre-existing matter, right, this kind of chaotic primordial stuff,
Uh-huh.
and he's bringing order to it, shaping it according to this perfect ideal.
Exactly. And that's where the teleological principle comes in. The idea is that everything in the universe is ordered towards a specific end or purpose. And that purpose is the realization of goodness. So it's not just random chance. It's intentional design driven by this benevolent will.
Yeah. And it's interesting that he uses this kind of anthropomorphic language to describe the demiurge. It makes me wonder, is Plato really talking about a literal being? Or is this more of a metaphorical representation of cosmic intelligence or something like that? What do you think?
That's a really good question, and one that scholars have debated for centuries. Whether the demiurge should be understood as a literal godlike figure or more as a symbol for the rational principles that govern the universe.
Right. In either way, it raises these really fascinating questions about, the nature of agency and causality.
Absolutely. And it's not just about understanding the cosmos in this detached, objective way, right? Plato actually connects this understanding of cosmic order to the human soul. He suggests that by contemplating this order, our rational souls can kind of realign themselves with that cosmic harmony. It's like a way of restoring this original excellence that he thinks has been kind of lost through our embodiment.
So it's almost like an ethical imperative to understand the cosmos for Plato, right? It's
Yeah.
not just about acquiring knowledge. It's about aligning ourselves with the good.
Exactly. And this whole idea of the universe being divinely crafted, of course, it wasn't universally accepted even in Plato's time. You had people like Aristotle who had some pretty strong disagreements with Plato's cosmology. But despite those early controversies, the Timaeus had this huge and lasting impact. It's really hard to overstate its influence.
It's really fascinating how certain philosophical texts kind of stand the test of time, right? Like, even if you don't agree with everything in it, there's something about the Timaeus that keeps drawing people back to it.
Absolutely, especially in the Middle Ages. Chalcidius's Latin translation of the Timaeus was incredibly influential. It was one of the primary ways that Western thinkers engaged with Plato's ideas for centuries. And even today, scholars are still grappling with the intricacies of the Timaeus and its implications.
All right, so let's get into the actual structure of the Timaeus. How does Plato unfold this grand narrative?
So the dialogue actually starts off by referencing a previous discussion that Socrates was having with others, kind of outlining an ideal political state, almost like a prequel to the Republic in some ways. And then Timaeus takes over and agrees to describe the creation of the universe and humanity.
Okay, so he's kind of moving from the ideal polis to the ideal cosmos.
Exactly. And his discourse follows a really clear structure. He starts with a kind of prologue, lays out his basic assumptions about the nature of reality, the distinction between being and becoming. Then he dives into the main part of his speech, which he breaks down into three stages. First, he talks about the achievements of intellect. the teleological explanations for the universe's order and goodness. Second, he brings in the role of necessity, the material causes and constraints that the demiurge has to work with. And third, he focuses on the cooperation of these two forces, intellect and necessity, in the creation of human beings.
Okay, so let's dive into that first part, the achievement of intellect. What's the core argument for why the universe exists at all and why it's good according to Plato?
Well, at the heart of it is the idea that the universe exists and is good because it's the work of this supremely good and generous demiurge right. He's motivated by his own goodness, and he wants to impart that goodness to creation. So he brings order to this pre-existing state of disorder that Plato describes as this kind of chaotic, primordial soup.
Okay, so that's the why, but what about the how?
Well, Plato describes the universe as a living thing, a zoon, imbued with intelligence and a soul. And this is a really radical move for his time to think of the universe as a living being, rather than just a collection of inert matter.
I mean, that's a pretty mind-blowing concept when you really think about it, right? A living universe.
Absolutely. And Plato goes on to argue that it's complete, containing all the different kinds of living things. It's unique because it's based on a unique model. And he talks about its physical composition. The four elements: fire for visibility, earth for tangibility, bound together by air and water. And even its spherical shape is significant. It's considered the most perfect and self-contained form.
Okay, and then there's the creation of the world's soul, right?
Right.
That seems like a really crucial part of imbuing the universe with intelligence and order.
Absolutely. Plato describes this elaborate process by which the demiurge creates the world's soul. He uses a mixture of divisible and indivisible sameness difference, and being kind of combines them in these specific mathematical ratios. It's pretty complex, but the basic idea is that the world's soul is this intermediary between the eternal realm of forms and the changing world of sensory experience. It allows the universe to kind of participate in both.
And this is what governs the movements of the heavenly bodies and creates this cosmic clock, this image of eternity that Plato talks about.
Exactly. And then, of course, there are individual human souls. How do they fit into this picture? Well, Plato suggests that they're also created by the demiurge. They're made of the same soul stuff as the world soul, but when they're embodied, they're implanted into our physical bodies, that creates a kind of disruption. Our souls can't move as freely or harmoniously because they're kind of weighed down by the body and bombarded by sensory information.
Okay, so our struggles with knowledge and clarity are partly a result of being embodied beings.
That's a key insight, and that's why Plato emphasizes the importance of discipline and education for the soul. It's about training the rational part of the soul to kind of regain its natural harmony, to overcome the distractions of the body.
Right, and even the design of our senses like vision is presented as serving this cognitive function. It's not just about pleasure, it's about acquiring knowledge about the world.
Right. But Plato recognizes that intellect alone doesn't tell the whole story. There are also material constraints that the demiurge has to work with. He has to work with the raw materials that are available to him, and those materials have their own inherent properties. And that's where the concept of necessity comes in.
So necessity represents the limits of what's possible, the inherent nature of the physical world that even the demiurge can't completely overcome.
Exactly. Plato uses this metaphor of persuasion. He says that intellect persuades necessity to the extent that's possible. It guides the material world towards the realization of the good, but it can't completely eliminate those material constraints.
And this is where we get this really intriguing concept of the receptacle, this third kind of being that's distinct from both forms and sensibles. What exactly is this receptacle? It seems pretty mysterious.
Yeah, it's one of the most debated and difficult concepts in the Timaeus. Plato himself says that it's hard to describe. He uses different analogies. He compares it to a goldsmith's wax or a mother or even a mirror. But the basic idea seems to be that it's this kind of underlying substrate that can receive and take on different forms.
So is it like the primordial matter of the universe, or is it more like space itself, the place where everything happens?
That's where the debate comes in. Some interpreters emphasize its material aspect. They see it as this formless stuff that the demiurge then shapes into the elements. Others focus on its spatial dimension. They see it as the place where things come into being and pass away.
Okay, so we have intellect, we have necessity, and we have this mysterious receptacle. How do they all work together to create the world as we know it?
Well, Plato describes this pre-cosmic state where the receptacle is in this constant chaotic motion, just this jumble of stuff. And then the demiurge steps in and he starts to bring order to this chaos. And the way he does that is by using these geometrical shapes, these platonic solids, as the building blocks of the four elements.
So this is where we get that famous connection between geometry and cosmology, right? The idea that the elements are actually made up of these perfect mathematical forms.
Exactly. Fire is associated with the tetrahedron, air with the octahedron, water with the icosahedron, and earth with the cube. And these solids, in turn, are made up of triangles. It's like this really elegant geometrical system that underlies the physical world.
And Plato actually uses this to explain why some elements can transform into others while others can't.
Right. He says that fire, air, and water can transform into each other because they're all made up of the same kind of triangle, the half equilateral triangle. But Earth is different. It's made up of a different kind of triangle, the isosceles triangle, so it can't be transformed into the other elements.
That's pretty insightful for his time, to be thinking about the properties of matter in terms of these underlying geometrical structures.
Absolutely. And it's a really early example of this kind of mathematical atomism, this idea that the world is made up of these tiny, indivisible particles that combine in different ways to create everything we see.
Okay, so that's the cosmos, but what about us humans? Where do we fit into this grand scheme?
Well, this is where Plato gets into the creation of human beings. And he distinguishes between our immortal souls, which he says are created by the demiurge himself, and our mortal bodies, which he says are created by these lesser gods.
Okay, so there's a kind of hierarchy of creation going on here.
Yeah. And because we have these immortal souls that are now housed in mortal bodies, there's a need for these mortal parts of the soul, the spirited and appetitive parts that Plato talks about in the Republic. These are the parts of the soul that are concerned with emotions and desires, the things that we share with animals.
So we're not just purely rational beings in Plato's view. We have these other aspects of our nature that are rooted in our physicality.
Right. And Plato even gives us this kind of map of the soul within the body. He says the rational part is located in the head, the spirited part in the chest, and the appetitive part in the belly.
It's almost like a blueprint for human psychology in a way.
Yeah, and he explains how the different organs of the body serve the needs of these different parts of the soul. So the lungs, for example, are there to cool down the spirited part of the soul when it gets too heated up.
But you mentioned earlier that necessity sometimes resists the demiurge's intentions. Are there any examples of that in the creation of human beings?
Yeah, Plato gives the example of the skull. He says that ideally intellect would have wanted a really thick skull to protect the brain, but that would have made it too difficult to perceive the world through our senses. So there's a kind of compromise. The skull is thick enough to provide some protection, but not so thick that it completely blocks out sensory input.
So it's a kind of balancing act between the ideal and the possible.
Exactly. And this helps to explain why the created world isn't perfectly good. There are these limitations imposed by the nature of matter.
Now, this whole creation narrative in the Timaeus, it's been interpreted in so many different ways throughout history. Is it supposed to be a literal account of how the universe came to be? Or is it more of a metaphorical or allegorical explanation?
That's one of the biggest questions that scholars have grappled with. There are some who take it very literally. They see it as a kind of scientific cosmogony. Others see it as more of a myth or a philosophical fable that's trying to convey certain truths about the nature of reality.
And then there's that famous phrase that Timaeus uses, right? He calls his account a likely story, eikos logos. What does he mean by that? Is he just saying, hey, don't take this too seriously?
Well, it's definitely a kind of disclaimer. Plato's acknowledging that his account is dealing with things that are inherently difficult to know with certainty. But he's not saying that it's just a made-up story. He's saying that it's the best explanation he can give based on the evidence and reasoning available to him.
So it's likely in the sense that it's plausible, it fits with what we know about the world.
Right. And I think it's important to remember the context of the dialogue. Timaeus is giving this speech to a group of people who are already familiar with Socrates and his philosophical ideas. So he's not trying to convince them of something outlandish. He's trying to offer a reasoned account that will make sense to them.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the key philosophical ideas in the Timaeus. One that seems really fundamental is this distinction between what always is and never becomes and what becomes and never is. What's the significance of that distinction?
Yeah, that's absolutely crucial. It's a distinction that runs throughout Plato's work, and it's really about two different ways of knowing. On the one hand, you have the eternal, unchanging realm of forms, the things that can only be grasped by intellect and reason. And on the other hand, you have the realm of becoming, the world of sensory experience, of things that are constantly changing.
So the forms are like the blueprints, and the sensible world is like the imperfect copies of those blueprints.
Exactly. And the demiurge is the intermediary. He uses his knowledge of the forms to shape the world of becoming to bring it as close as possible to the perfection of the eternal realm.
And so the very fact that the universe is something that becomes is the reason why it needs a cause, a craftsman, to bring it into existence.
Right. Something can't come from nothing. So if the universe is temporal, if it has a beginning, then it must have been caused by something that's outside of time, something that's eternal.
And that's the demiurge.
Exactly. And the fact that the universe is ordered and beautiful leads Plato to argue that this cause must be both good and intelligent.
Which brings us back to that teleological principle, right? The idea that everything is ordered towards an end, towards the good.
Absolutely. And this connects to another really important idea in Plato's philosophy, the foam of the good, which he discusses in the Republic. The idea that there's this ultimate source of goodness that kind of radiates outwards and informs the entire universe.
Now, one thing that's always struck me about the Timaeus is the role of intellect, or nous. It's not just the demiurge himself, but the intelligence that guides the demiurge. Where does that fit in ontologically? Is it a form? Is it something else entirely?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that's generated a lot of debate. Some scholars have tried to identify intellect with the world soul or with a specific form, like the form of intelligence. But I think there are good reasons to think that it's actually something distinct from both of those.
So it's like this transcendent principle of intelligence that's somehow prior to both the forms and the world of becoming.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important point to emphasize. It's not just about a God who creates the world, it's about this underlying principle of rationality that informs the entire cosmos.
And this contrasts pretty sharply with Aristotle's view, right? Aristotle's unmoved mover is much more impersonal and abstract.
Right. And for Aristotle, the purpose or telos of things is immanent. It's inherent within the natural world itself. But for Plato, the purpose comes from outside. It's imposed on the world by this transcendent intellect.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the actual physics of the Timaeus. Plato goes into a lot of detail about the properties, the elements, the precosmic state, and all of that. How does that relate back to these broader philosophical ideas that we've been talking about?
Well, I think the physics in the Timaeus is really fascinating because it shows us how Plato is trying to bridge the gap between his metaphysics and his cosmology. He's not just content to talk about these abstract principles, he wants to show how they actually play out in the physical world.
So he's grounding his metaphysics in a kind of physical theory.
Exactly. And that's where the receptacle and the geometrical construction of the elements come in. They provide a kind of material basis for the cosmos. And it's also where we see the interplay between intellect and necessity.
So the demiurge is using his knowledge of the forms to shape the receptacle, but he's also constrained by the inherent properties of the material world.
Right. And that's why the created world isn't perfect. There are these inherent limitations that even the demiurge can't overcome.
Okay, so to kind of bring it all together for our listeners, what would you say are some of the key takeaways from the Timaeus? What's its lasting significance for us as philosophers today?
Well, I think one of the most important things about the Timaeus is that it offers us this incredibly rich and detailed vision of a cosmos that's both ordered and beautiful. It's a cosmos that's imbued with purpose and meaning. And it invites us to think about our place within this cosmos.
And it connects that cosmic vision to our own lives.
Right.
It suggests that understanding the order of the universe can help us to live better, more virtuous lives.
Exactly. It's about aligning ourselves with the good, both in ourselves and in the cosmos as a whole.
And even if we don't accept every detail of Plato's account, the Timaeus raises these really profound questions about the nature of reality, causality, the relationship between mind and matter, questions that are still relevant to philosophy today.
Absolutely. And for me, one of the things that I always find myself coming back to is Plato's intuition that mathematics might be the key to understanding the fundamental structure of the universe. That's an idea that's been incredibly influential in the history of science.
Yeah, and it's something that we're still grappling with today in physics and cosmology.
Right. So even though the Timaeus was written over 2,000 years ago, it still has this incredible power to make us think, to make us question, to make us wonder.
And for you, our listener, I think one of the most important takeaways from the Timaeus is this idea that the universe isn't just a random collection of stuff. It's a cosmos. It's an ordered and beautiful whole. And that order reflects something profound about the nature of reality.
And that raises a final question for us to ponder. If the universe is indeed a product of intelligent design, whether that's a divine craftsman or some other principle of rationality, what does that imply about our own responsibilities as beings who are part of that design?
That's something for us all to think about. Thanks for listening.